Hi, today I'm going to give a little bit of a recap of the Preakness Stakes, which happened this past Saturday, and then give a little look ahead to the Belmont Stakes, which takes place 3 weeks from this past Saturday. It's 3 Saturdays after the Preakness. And it is early for the Belmont, so looking at the Preakness, this was a very, very fun race. Congratulations to Cloud Computing on the win. He came out of the 2 post, and this was definitely a little bit of an upset. Coming into the race, of course, most of the attention was on Always Dreaming, the Kentucky Derby winner, and if he could win the second leg of the Triple Crown and set up a possible Triple Crown win at the Belmont. And some of the attention was also on Classic Empire, who was the morning line favorite in the Kentucky Derby, finished 4th in that race after a bad trip. So if we look at the race, a lot of the talk, and one thing that I had discussed in my last video was, because Always Dreaming and Classic Empire were the 2 big horses, they were next to each other. They were 4 and 5 in the post, and how the race would shape up in terms of how they would go out. If we kind of knew Always Dreaming would try to push the pace because that's his style. Classic Empire is versatile. He has done a couple of different things in his races. You know, he can stalk, he can take the lead, or he can even come from behind almost like a closer. And what we saw in this race was that they challenged each other in a big way. So right out of the gate, boom, they're up right next to each other, going very fast. No other horse really challenged them in terms of the lead. There were a couple that were not too far off, but there weren't any else on the pace. So that was pretty much, if you look at the race replay, that is pretty much what happened right up until just about the final turn, where Classic Empire and Always Dreaming were right there with each other. And then right as they entered the stretch, Always Dreaming started to fade a little bit. I really like Always Dreaming and think he's a great horse, so this was a little unfortunate to see, I guess, because I really expected him to perform really well in this race. So he started to pull back a little bit, and he wound up finishing 8th. So you kind of, watching the race live, you could kind of tell once he started to drift back, you know, he was definitely in trouble at that point. Classic Empire just kept going, and there was about a 3 or so second spot there where you were like, wow, Classic Empire is gonna just totally run away with this race and win by potentially 5 lengths, because he was accelerating and Always Dreaming was drifting back, and there were no other horses at that point, none of the closers or none of the other horses that were stalking the pace, where you're like, okay, here they come and they're gonna catch Classic Empire. And then right as they were getting to the meat of the stretch, out comes Cloud Computing, skyrocketing, the number 2 horse. And this is a horse that is trained by Chad Brown. He did not run in the Kentucky Derby. He did have a lot of people were high on him coming into this race. I think out of the new shooters, the horses that didn't run in the Kentucky Derby, there were, I believe, 5 of them that ran in the Preakness. I think most of the attention went to 2 of them. One was the 2-horse Cloud Computing, who of course won the race, and then the other, who I put most of my attention to, was the 10-horse Conquest Mo Money. Conquest Mo Money is a speed horse in an ideal situation, and I thought he was going to be maybe in the lead, even ahead of Always Dreaming and Classic Empire. And although he didn't run a terrible race, he never really did his thing. He was never really challenging for the pace. He didn't make a big move at the end. And so, yeah, he didn't run a terrible race, but he definitely was not pretty much at any point, I think it's fair to say he was never a serious threat to win or even finish in the top two. But anyway, back to the cloud computing. He just kind of took off, and he caught Classic Empire, and it was like, wow. In those seconds, there's obviously not much time in the stretch, and you're just thinking like, okay, can he pull off this upset? Not only over Always Dreaming, but then to beat both of them, Always Dreaming and Classic Empire, and he did. And it wasn't by much. If you look at the replay, it really, give credit to Classic Empire who competed, but you just have to really congratulate Cloud Computing because he just was not going to be denied. He just gave everything he had and won the race. I think it is worth mentioning that he didn't run the Kentucky Derby, so perhaps he was a little bit fresher. But that's horse racing. That's kind of how it works. That's why it's so difficult to win the Triple Crown, has been mentioned so many times, because not only, of course, you have to win the Kentucky Derby against all of the best 3-year-olds in the country, but then you have to come back 2 weeks later and probably run against some other talented horses that, in the case of Cloud Computing, he had a 6-week break compared to Always Dreaming Classic Empire's 2-week break. So you can definitely see that's what makes the horses that do win the Triple Crown so special, like American Pharoah a couple of years ago, or of course going all the way back to 1978 before that. Or even to win the first 2 legs, or win, a combination 2 out of the 3, whether it's, any combination. It is tough. So I did want to look at some of the other horses that ran here. Gunavera was a horse who had good odds into the Kentucky Derby and had a good amount of hype, and then same thing coming into the Preakness, because he didn't run that great in the Kentucky Derby, and he was a little disappointing again in the Preakness. He didn't, he didn't run terribly, but he never made his move and was able to be a serious threat to win here. Looking at Lee was the underdog horse in the Kentucky Derby that made a huge move at the end to finish second, and I think coming into the Preakness, people were saying, okay, was the Kentucky Derby his height? Would he ever get back? And although he only finished 4th, I would give him a lot of credit for that, because he did beat, the other closers like Hens and Gunavera, and he finished above Always Dreaming. So well done to Looking at Lee for, to finish second in the Derby, come back 4th in the Preakness. When you consider his odds in the Derby, I think were something to the effect of 30 to 1. That's very impressive for him to do that. So now looking ahead to the Belmont, I think a lot of people, when a horse hasn't won the first 2 legs, I think sometimes the Belmont does lose its luster a little bit, and that's fair. That's fair, because the Triple Crown is such a big deal. They're really, in terms of the big horses, there have not been decisions made, from what I understand as I'm making this video now, as to who's going to run the Belmont. So Always Dreaming, I think he's trained by Todd Pletcher. I think that they would ideally like to run him in the Belmont, but I think if they look at him and say, okay, he didn't run great in the Preakness, could he find that Kentucky Derby form with the 3 weeks rest ahead of the Belmont, then I think they will run him. We'll just have to wait and see. Classic Empire, again, I think trained by Mark Casse. I think, will they give him the rest after 2 really tough races that he ran in the Derby and then in the Preakness? Or will they say, this is a horse that deserves to run the 3rd leg, he deserves to have the chance to win a Triple Crown race? I think that'll be interesting to see what they decide there. And then, of course, there's Cloud Computing now, who, as I just mentioned, to have a horse with a chance to win the Preakness and in the Belmont, that's pretty rare. So will his trainer Chad Brown, um, that'll be really interesting to see a cloud competing. And I would be really curious to see, let's just say let's just say, for argument's sake, Classic Empire sits out the Belmont, but Always Dreaming runs, and Cloud Computing does. What would the odds be like? Would Cloud Computing become the favorite? Would it go back to Always Dreaming? Or if you say, okay, Always Dreaming doesn't run and Classic Empire does, is Classic Empire the favorite? I'm really curious how that would all shake out. And then, in terms of some of the other horses, I would love to see some of these closers because, of course, the Belmont is the longest race of the three. So, looking at Lee, maybe, of course, he will likely be a little bit tired, but potentially that would be the race that sets up for him to get the win if he's running hard still at the end. Could that finally be Guinevera's race to finish in the top two or so? Or potentially are any of the horses that ran the Kentucky Derby and then skipped the Preakness, can they make a run in the Belmont? So I'm thinking of Irish War Cry, McCracken, Gormley, Taprit. I don't know about some of these injuries though, because a lot of these horses had some nicks coming out of the Kentucky Derby, and there's a bunch of others. Those are four off the top of my head that I can think of. So the Belmont is definitely going to be interesting, but I think so much of it depends on who runs, of course. And I don't know what the timetable is for the trainers and the ownership team to decide. But I would love to see at least two of the three of Classic Empire, Always Dreaming, and Cloud Computing to run. And then potentially, as I mentioned, like an Irish War Cry. I don't know about McCracken, what his health status is, or like I mentioned, Taprit, who is also trained by Pletcher, I believe, or Gormley, who was a horse that some people liked going to the Derby. So it should be really interesting. I am excited for the Belmont. Congratulations again to Cloud Computing. I am a little disappointed that Always Dreaming didn't either get the win or at least come down and finish in the top three. But as I think Todd Pletcher himself mentioned, it just wasn't really his day, and hopefully that is not the last we saw of him, because that Derby win was so impressive, and the Florida Derby as well. So hopefully we see him, whether it's in the Belmont or in a race after that, maybe the Breeders' Cup or one of those other big non-Triple Crown races. So thank you for watching this video. Keep an eye out for the Belmont announcements in terms of who's running, and also once those announcements are made, what the odds when the morning line comes out, who gets the early edge there. Alright, so thanks for watching. Talk to you soon.